Today's topic is injector sizing. Now, this is one of those topics that is really critical to understanding what's going on during the regeneration process, and getting this component right in assembling systems will eliminate a lot of headaches and issues around issues with brining. Getting this done correctly is critical to this process. Residential systems are much more forgiving than commercial systems. Commercial systems, if you're going to try to optimize, getting injector sizing is critical. And this is all based on media. The media that we're going to put in the tank that's going to exploit the features of our valve and tank combination. So getting this right is going to lead to your success. So we're going to go over what suggested regenerant flow is by manufacturers, various resin manufacturers. These aren't recommendations. This was just taken from their own literature. We're going to go over the different types of injectors that are available, the flow path within a water softening valve, calculating injector flow, choosing an injector, and injector total flow data. So just like any process in water treatment, if you don't have good information, you're going to get poor results out. So garbage in, garbage out. Always true in water treatment. And there's a context. Every water treatment device or instrument ever created exists in the context of pressure and flow on top of the water chemistry involved. So if we need to really understand pressure and flow to understand whether our device is working properly or if we need to adjust it. And this is where you can really understand whether or not it's a mechanical issue with the valve itself, or is it an infrastructure issue that's an opportunity to solve a problem for a customer. So suggested regenerant flow. You can find this information on manufacturer's spec sheets for resin, and they will give you a range, 0.25 to 5.5 GPM per cubic foot. This is also available in liters per minute per cubic meter of resin as well for the folks using metric. But they've given you a range. So how do we decide which end of the range to use? Well, with water treatment devices, we are always going to want to shoot for the heart cut of the range. Why? Because that leaves us wiggle room up and down for changes in pressure and variations in water chemistry. So we're going to take that average flow. Yes, I know, strictly from a math sense, we should be doing integral calculus over this range to get the exact median. We're not going that deep. We're just going to take an average of the recommended regenerant flows and split for the middle. So 0.25 plus 0.5 is equal to 0.75 divided by 2, 0.375 gallon per minute flow rate is right in the middle for our injector total flow. So get the information right and you'll have success. Now, if we take a look at another OEM's, resin OEM's spec sheet, very similar requirements, very similar resins and the requirement of regenerant flow. Now, another manufacturer, very different recommendations from 0.3 to 1 GPM. This is a 0.65 GPM flow rate that we're going to shoot for right in the middle to keep this resin happy. And then another manufacturer's resin, and these are all sodium form cation exchange resins. So these aren't any great variation in product here. They recommend 0.5 to 1.5 GPM, and that gives us a 1 GPM flow rate for total regenerant flow through the resin bed. So various resins, different total regenerant flow rates. And that's important, especially if you're switching out resins, to understand what was in the tank prior and was it sized properly. And if you're going to change that resin, do you have the correct injector in the valve for that resin? So go back to the OEM spec sheets, get good information, and adjust a valve from there. So what are the injectors that we have available? Well, we have the 1600, 1610, 1700, and 1800 injector families. The 1600 injector family is used on all of these various valves that we have. And these are two-piece injectors that are threaded into an injector body. And that makes a complete Venturi system or jet pump or inductor or eductor, depending upon whatever terminology you wish to use. But essentially, we're using a cone to shoot a small amount of water through a nozzle, creating a pressure drop inside a cavity, creating a vacuum based on this continual jet flowing. We have them for standard cold water. We have them for doing iron removal with potassium permanganate, with PVC construction. We have them with stainless steel for hot water applications so they don't rot out very quickly or warp or change shape with the hot water as well. So we have the option of picking an appropriate injector for your circumstance. Remember, if you're going to be doing other things besides just softening, you're going to want to go to that OEM's spec sheet for, let's say, magnesium green sand and find out what their total regenerant flow is and apply that for potassium permanganate in that situation. So whatever you're putting in the tank that you're regenerating, you're going to want to understand that manufacturer's recommendation for total regenerant flow. The 1610 injector parts, these are for the 5800, 10, and 12 valve families only. These are two-piece injectors. They can be pulled apart so they can be cleaned. And the 58, 10, and 12 has a check ball on the end of it as well. Now, what I like about this picture is you can see that relationship between the stream of water coming through the nozzle through the body. And when this is popped into a housing, you get a sealed shape. And right here, this little open air space, that is where the saturated brine from the brine tank is mixed with the water coming in a stream to create the vacuum. And that's where we're going to create the appropriate brine solution for regeneration. Now, the 1700 series is used on some of our larger valves, more in a commercial application. These are two-piece injectors dropped into a injector body that forms the whole jet pump or Venturi. And these are much larger in size because we're moving more water with them. The 1800, this is for our largest softening valves. These are the 3150 and 3900, much higher volumes of water and brine being moved here. So you have a larger inductor or injector. So injectors flow during brine draw and slow rinse. What's going on here? Because if you look at the back of our manuals for any of our valves, you're going to see charts about injector flow. You're going to see injector flow, brine draw, and total flow within those charts. So that's going to allow you to tell what pressure, what flow and draw you're getting in multiple stages of it being used. And we'll go through it here in just a second. So the injector flow path, what's going on inside the valve when this happens? Well, the main piston position moves to a place where we're going to force water up through a screen to remove any bulk particulate, so you don't want to clog our injectors. And then the water is going to come down through an injector into the tank. Okay? That's going to go through that nozzle, through the throat. And that is going to do one thing for us, cause a pressure drop inside this injector body. And that will create a vacuum on this line going down to the brine tank. So water flowing in, vacuum is created. Notice the level of the check ball in the brine safety valve in the tank. It's floating. The water is floating in the brine tank. We've got a saturated brine solution, and this float allows for the brine to be drawn out. The flow rate through the injector and through the tank to drain. So the water is going to come up through the screen, down through the nozzle, pull in brine, down through the tank, up through the distributor pilot tube here, and out to waste. The total flow here is limited by the injector, period. As much water as you can push through that injector during a period of time, that's the flow, period. So during brine draw, you have the water coming in here, going through the injector. This brine valve has changed position to allow this water flow to be drawn in. You're going to see the brine drawn up and in and mixed right here by the vacuum created. That's why it's critical from the entry point to the injector all the way through this system down to the brine valve here, safety valve in the tank, to maintain airtight seals. Any air leaking will impact the injector. So what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to mix this saturated brine solution with incoming water flow, and what we're looking for is an optimal 10% brine solution. 7 to 14% is acceptable, 9 to 11% ideal. And this becomes more critical with the larger the systems or the application if it's commercial or medical. Residential, if we're in that 7 to 14% range, most of the time we're fine. In commercial applications, we may want to pay more attention to this to get this right. So total flow is that recommendation off the OEM spec sheet is your injector flow plus your brine draw. That brine is then forced through a wave through the resin in a band that comes up and out and goes to waste. Now, the air check in the check valve, in the brine safety valve in the brine tank, is what controls the switch from brine draw to slow rinse. There is no change in piston position on the valve itself or in the brine valve. The change happens here when the brine level goes below the intake of the safety valve. This ball seals, and then you get nothing but water going through at the injector's flow rate without brine. Notice that there's nothing here. We're going to want to ensure we have no air leaks here as well. That way you don't put air into the tank and you get a good regeneration. You're not messing up that brine ratio as well. But the only change here is this check ball seating. And then for the balance of this cycle time, we're going to push a wave of tap water through the tank to push out, force that brine to move down the tank and then up and out, finishing the exchange process, and then rinsing any extra salt out of the resin tank. So now to nuts and bolts and figuring this stuff out, how to calculate injector flow. Well, we need to know how much resin we're dealing with, right? Because all those specifications from the resin manufacturers are for 1 cubic foot of resin. Somebody asked, can you use a 10 cubic foot softener for an example? Sure, let's just throw 10 cubic feet of resin here. We'll go through it. I chose 1 for this example just to keep it easy. But all you're going to do here is take your cubic foot of resin and multiply that by the resin manufacturer's regenerant flow rate. And that will equal your total flow. Now, injector flow is always resin OEM specific. Know your media. If you change the media, you may have to change injectors. So if we were doing with 1 cubic foot, I'm going to use the 0.65 for this resin. At 1 cubic foot, it would be 0.65 GPM. For a 10 cubic foot softener, you just put 10 into here. 10 times 0.65 would be 6.5 gallon per minute regenerant flow. Okay. Now that's not going to, we'll go into that, which one to select there in a minute, because these examples are based on 1 gallon. So we're going to choose an exact 1 cubic foot of resin. We're going to look at the 1600 series injector. We'll get into that example once we get into larger injectors. But you are going to want to understand your operating PSI on site. This is dynamic pressure, not static pressure. What that means is, what is the pressure when the water is flowing in the plumbing versus when the valve is shut off? No flow. Chicago, Illinois is notorious for this, for having 80 PSI in a building, but as soon as you open a faucet, it drops to 20 PSI. We're concerned with the open flow, dynamic flow pressure here, not static. And then you're going to have your injector total flow, which are based on the charts. And this will lead to injector sizing. So how does that work? With we typically assume when we send something out of our plant 60 PSI. This shows you the need to adjust based on size. So from the previous example at 0.65 total flow, we're going to go to 60 PSI. That's the pressure we have, dynamic. And we're going to go over to the number that just exceeds 0.65. This keeps us in the hard cut of that resin, and it allows for increases and decreases in pressure to keep that brine ratio the same. Okay. In the smaller residential stuff, we have to have a significant pressure drop to drop us out of range. Here, it's about 40 PSI. If you had the red injector, it would be literally 30 PSI. And if you had 125 PSI in the building and were trying to squeak by with this injector, it wouldn't take a whole lot of pressure drop to start putting you out of range. So depending on what the incoming water pressure is, you may need to tweak your injector size. On the 1610, that same adjustment, we looked over and made the same calculations. It's going to be a 0.77. Notice here in this chart that this number is almost exactly double this number. This is the point where we switch from 1 cubic foot to 2 cubic feet in the chart. Just for tanks, just thoughts right there. That's why there's such a jump there. So you have these charts in the back of every manual. Depending on the valve, you're going to have different charts to choose from. Now let's go ahead and take a look at that 10 cubic foot example where we were going to need, instead of 0.65 GPM flow rate, we are going to need 6.5 GPM flow rate for 10 cubic feet of resin. So if we are using a 3150 or 3900, you're going to have the 1800 injector system. Well, at 60 psi, let's assume, to keep this simple, a 3150. At 60 psi, we're going to go across and look at 6.5 GPM. Well, 5.42 is too low. 9.1 is the next one up. We're going to want to use that red injector. That may be too high, or maybe are we using a 2900 on a 10 cubic foot system, and we look at 60 psi, we're going to want to use a 6C injector to get that number correctly. So depending on the softener and the valve you use and the plumbing diameter there, you're going to be able to select different injectors. Same thing with the 1800 injector. If you're dealing only with 40 psi, you're going to skip to that red injector as well. But if you were in Chicago, you're going to have to skip up to the 7.21 gallon per minute in the white to effectively manage that brining. You see, a question came in. I see a lot of 10 cubic foot softeners with a 2850 valve using a 1700 injector system. These systems use resin with a 1 GPM. So I don't see how this would work. A 1 GPM brine line, brine line flow control, or a 1 gallon per minute injector? Because if we've got a 2850 valve that's using a 1700 injector series, we've got 60 psi, you would have to bump that up to a 6.57 injector. If they are using the yellow, a green, or a white, it won't work in that situation. If they're using a resin with a 1 GPM total regenerant flow, that would be a 10 GPM per minute injector. So that isn't going to work with a 1700 injector system. You're correct. You would have to go up to an 1800 injecting system. So that's a situation where they don't have the injector balanced to the resin in the tank. So it's really about getting that information right. And essentially, they're dropping the percentage of brine low, and they're not going to get full regeneration on the resin, and they probably have short life on the resin in those circumstances, because you're probably brining well below that 10% solution. So that's one that would be a fairly quick adjustment to the right injector if they had everything else equal, by popping in a red injector instead of the other colors there, they could solve that problem. But if they're using the yellow, green, or white, it's not the right sized injector. That's exactly where this information is critical, is in commercial sizing. Because you're dealing with so much higher flows and more volumes of resin, we really want to get that percentage right in the range we want it to be in to extract as much life out of that resin as possible and make it cost effective. Yeah, there's opportunity there for you to correct that situation for sure. Just to let you know, we have built a new training.request@pentair.com email box that is manned by both Mark and myself. And this is for where anyone can request training. Hopefully when they start letting us travel again, you can request in-person product training or troubleshooting training. We can do water quality training or chemistry training, basics of water treatment, for new hires and things like that. Opportunity training on where you can use various valves and controls and opportunities in markets and things like that. Filter cartridge applications. Pentec has a plethora of options there, and selecting the right filter can really augment your cartridge filter sales. Reverse osmosis systems for drinking water and membrane selection and choices and troubleshooting on those systems as well. Or if you just want to schedule some time to talk some shop about projects or sizing or things like that, more than happy to do that. Just because we're sitting around in an informal session talking through issues, that's training. That's just training from a Socratic method versus a classroom method like we're doing now. Or if you just have feedback, if you have issues with product or want to understand why we're doing something or we've done something, sit in and talk to us. I was a dealer once myself for 25 years. And you know what? It's nice to be able to have somebody at a manufacturer that'll listen. Well, the great thing about Mark and I is we deal with our product managers and our engineers all the time. And, the sooner you guys can let us know about stuff, the sooner we can help get changes made. We don't make promises on that, but we can definitely put things in the right ears and catalog those conversations and things like that, and hopefully get you some traction going there. Because we're kind of like the Titanic. It takes a little bit for us to get that boat turned. So if we're headed towards an iceberg, let us know, and we'll help get that boat turned for you as well. So training when you want it, when you need it. We're available for, 10, 15-minute webinars, that type of stuff. If you want us to sit in with your service team or sales team during a training meeting that you have, we'll be happy to pop in as a guest speaker as well. So we are your huckleberries, as we say when it comes to training. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to either ask it via the chat feature or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. If not, have the balance of your afternoon back, and thank you very much for attending. Are there any questions? Now, this isn't, one of those things that you're going to be changing a lot. This is something someone should be doing on the front end and making sure you're getting this specification right, especially with residential customers. It's not that big of an issue. But from a troubleshooting perspective, when you can't figure out why your resin isn't performing or lasting in a market, this may be the smoking gun. This is the type of thing that will cause issues if you have slow recovering wells, bladder tanks that aren't charged properly with the proper pre-charge pressure, a weak or failing well pump, a variable speed drive pump may be the solution to it all. You may not have to change the injector. I'm a big fan of managing our pressure and flows. Why? Because if you manage your pressure or flow going into water treatment equipment, you can get the most out of it. You stabilize that one variable that you really can't control remotely or with your specification or installation of the product. Is there a downside to upsizing to blue injectors from a white injector on smaller softeners like 24,000 to 32,000 grain softeners? And that's going to be the 1600 system from white to blue. Well, let's take a look at that. If my resin is a 0.65, I should have the white. But you know what? If I go up here, that's doubling the flow. Okay? That means I'm also going to double the concentration. And once you get over 14%, you're throwing salt away. Basically, we don't have the density that we want of brine, you don't improve the chemistry happening at the surface of the bead with more salt. So what you're going to do there is just waste salt for that customer. You will get a decent brining, but over time you're going to see capacity slip because you may not get everything off, especially if you're dealing with waters that have stuff in it besides hardness, any heavier metals, +3 cations, aluminum, some forms of copper, anything that might be +3 in the water. If you're, have a deep well where there isn't a whole lot of oxygen, you got a whole lot of +3 iron in it, and it hasn't hit any air yet, you may have some hard time regenerating that resin with too much salt at that brine ratio. When we switch from 6 to 9, we're increasing not the concentration of salt, but the bandwidth of the salt going down and through. Could you give a definition for nozzle and throat, and what's the difference between them? The nozzle itself is what creates the stream, a thin laminar flow stream that shoots down the throat, okay? And what that does is it shoots straight down the center of that throat where it doesn't touch the sides, okay? And that's critical to a Venturi's operation. And that throat just acts as a channel, okay? And by shooting water through it, have you ever been standing at the side of the road and ever had a large vehicle go by you really fast, and you could feel the air suck you towards the road as a semi-truck goes by? Well, that's the same sort of effect we have here with the Venturi. As we're shooting that thin stream of water down that throat, we're pulling the air in that throat with us, and that creates a pressure drop, and that will draw air in, because anytime you have pressure drop, you're creating kind of a vacuum, and nature wants to fill that vacuum. In this case, it's brine from the brine tank. So once that comes in, that nozzle starts to pull that brine and mix it in the throat and send it downstream. So that throat is where the mixing takes place, and it's also the target for where we want to shoot water through. That also explains why we can't have any obstruction or scale buildup or defect in that nozzle tip. If you nick or scar that nozzle tip, you'll change the flow path, and you'll mess up the Venturi action, and you won't create a draw. That's why it's critical to get those in the proper order and the proper flow path. If you are cleaning debris out of nozzles by poking something through it, I do suggest you just replace nozzles rather than poke them out. But if you're going to poke them out, do not use a metal object. Use a toothpick. Use something softer, because if you nick or mar that nozzle, you're going to change that flow path. And if you change that flow path and it starts splashing off that throat, you're going to change the Venturi draw action. And that, in a commercial application, will have significant impact. In a residential application, customer's not necessarily going to notice a difference. But if you're using that in a commercial application for high purity water pretreatment, over time you could lead to falling membranes because you're not getting good resin regeneration long term. And with the volumes of water used in commercial applications, that can show up a lot quicker than in a residential application. Let's take a look at those throat injectors. Notice that one is This one's still kind of to scale. All right. When you go ahead and look at this nozzle, it's much smaller than the throat. That's what we're looking to achieve. And this is actually spaced apart inside the valve body. So you're getting a little bit of a distance here to draw outside. This is a good way to picture it. Are there any more questions? So here you can see the throat and nozzle. The nozzle here in these units are much smaller because our nozzle is so much longer. And you're shooting it right past here. This creates an intense vacuum right in that space. Are there any more questions? Earlier today, we had the question, does temperature affect venturis? Not particularly, because we're reducing the water flow so much through this nozzle that temperature doesn't play a real role here, unless you're overcoming the materials, construction, where you really need to upgrade from plastic or PVC to a stainless steel injector throat. That's where you're going to see issues and you're going to want to change materials. But in the larger units, it's not typically a problem. Thank you very much for attending and have a wonderful evening.